You're holding on not because it feels right, but because you're hoping it will become right. And that's where so many people lose themselves. Because when you care deeply, when you invest your heart, your time, your energy, you don't just walk away easily. You try harder. You become more patient, more understanding, more forgiving. But let me tell you something powerful. Not every connection you feel is a connection you're meant to keep. Sometimes the very resistance you're experiencing is protection. When someone is avoidant, they don't meet you with openness. They meet you with distance. And at first, you tell yourself a story. They just need time. They've been hurt before. If I love them enough, they'll open up. But here's the truth that changes everything. Love is not supposed to feel like chasing someone who keeps stepping back. When God doesn't want you with someone, He doesn't always remove them instantly. Instead, He allows you to see clearly. He lets the inconsistency speak. He lets the silence stretch longer than it should. He lets the confusion grow so loud that you can't ignore it anymore. Because clarity is a form of mercy. The first thing that happens is you start feeling tired, not just physically, but emotionally. You're the one holding conversations together. You're the one trying to create closeness. And deep down, you know this isn't mutual. That exhaustion, it's not weakness. It's your soul telling you, this is not where you're meant to rest. Then comes the confusion, mixed signals, hot and cold behavior, moments of closeness followed by distance. And you start questioning yourself, what did I do wrong? Why did they pull away? But understand this, confusion is not a sign of love. It's a sign of misalignment. Real connection doesn't leave you guessing where you stand. Then something even deeper begins to happen. You start shrinking. You stop expressing your needs fully. You hesitate before saying how you feel. You become a smaller version of yourself just to avoid pushing them away. And in that moment, you're no longer in a relationship. You're in survival mode. But you weren't created to be tolerated. You were created to be cherished. And when God sees you lowering your standards, silencing your truth, abandoning your worth, He intervenes not always by force, but by friction. That's why things stop flowing. That's why conversations feel harder. That's why no matter how much effort you give, it doesn't build something solid. Because what's meant for you doesn't require you to betray yourself to keep it. Another thing you'll notice is the cycle. You get a glimpse of hope. Maybe they show up, maybe they open up just enough, and you think, this is it, it's finally changing. But then distance returns, and that cycle repeats until you're emotionally drained. Why? Because sometimes the lesson isn't about fixing the relationship. It's about breaking your attachment to something that isn't right for you. And finally, there's that quiet voice inside you. The one you've been trying to ignore. The one that whispers, this doesn't feel right. The one that nudges you when you're overthinking their behavior. The one that knows you deserve more than this. That voice is not insecurity. That voice is guidance. And here's the most important truth. When God doesn't want you with someone, it's not rejection. It's redirection. It's not punishment. It's protection. Because somewhere out there is a connection that doesn't require you to question your worth. A connection where your presence is valued, not avoided. Where your emotions are met, not dismissed. Where love flows instead of forcing you to fight for scraps of attention. But you'll never reach that if you keep holding on to what's not meant for you. So the question isn't, why isn't this working? The real question is, why am I still trying to make it work when everything in me knows it shouldn't? Because the moment you let go of what drains you, you make space for what's destined to fulfill you. And that's where your real story begins. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly, almost so quietly that at first you don't even recognize it for what it is. You just notice that something feels heavier. Conversations that once felt exciting now feel like effort. Waiting for a reply feels longer than it should. You begin to carry a weight that you can't quite explain, but you feel it in your chest, in your thoughts, in the way your energy dips throughout the day. Emotional exhaustion isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always look like breaking down or walking away. Sometimes it looks like staying while feeling drained. It looks like constantly thinking about what to say next, how to say it, when to say it, just to maintain a connection that should flow naturally. You start to realize that you're doing more emotional labor than you ever signed up for, and yet you keep going, hoping that eventually it will balance out. You replay conversations in your mind, analyzing every word, every pause, every shift in tone. You wonder if you said too much or not enough. You question whether you came across too strong or too distant. And in doing that, you slowly disconnect from your natural way of being. Instead of showing up as yourself, you start showing up as the version of you that you think will keep them from pulling away. That's where the exhaustion deepens, because pretending, adjusting, and overthinking require energy. A lot of it. And the hardest part is, you don't always blame them at first. You blame yourself. You tell yourself you need to be more patient, more understanding, more chill. You convince yourself that if you could just master the right balance, everything would fall into place. But no matter how much you adjust, the same pattern repeats. You give more, they withdraw. You reach out, they hesitate. You try to build closeness, and somehow it feels like you're the only one holding the structure together. Over time, this imbalance starts to wear you down emotionally. You begin to feel tired not because you don't care, but because you care so much, and it's not being met with the same consistency. Your mind is constantly occupied, your emotions are constantly engaged, and yet there's very little sense of security in return. What makes it even more confusing is that there are moments, small, fleeting moments, where everything feels right again. A good conversation, a moment of openness, a glimpse of connection. And in those moments, you feel re-energized. You think, this is why I'm holding on. But those moments don't last long enough to sustain you. They fade, and you're left chasing that feeling again, putting in more effort, hoping to recreate something that isn't stable to begin with. And slowly, you start neglecting yourself. Your own needs, your own peace, your own emotional well-being, they take a back seat. You prioritize the connection over your own balance. You become so focused on keeping things from falling apart that you don't realize you're the one falling apart internally. Because real connection isn't supposed to feel like this. It's not supposed to leave you constantly drained, questioning and overextending yourself. It's not supposed to require you to sacrifice your emotional stability just to keep someone close. That exhaustion you feel isn't random. It's not just because you're overthinking or too sensitive. It's a signal, a very real, very important signal that something in this dynamic is out of alignment. And the longer you ignore it, the louder it becomes, until you can no longer pretend that what you're feeling is normal. At first, it feels small, almost unnoticeable, a delayed reply here, a vague answer there. You brush it off because you don't want to overreact. You tell yourself they're busy, distracted, going through something. And to be fair, sometimes that's true. But what starts as occasional inconsistency slowly becomes a pattern, and that's when confusion begins to take hold. You find yourself checking your phone more often than you'd like to admit. Not out of desperation, but because you genuinely don't know what to expect. One day they're engaged, attentive, maybe even affectionate. The next day, it's like a switch has flipped. Their energy changes. Their responses become shorter. The warmth you felt just yesterday suddenly disappears, and you're left trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. This is where your mind starts working overtime. You begin to analyze everything. You scroll back through conversations, trying to pinpoint where things shifted. You wonder if you said something wrong, if your tone changed, if you came across too interested or not interested enough. You start creating explanations just to fill the silence, because silence without clarity can feel unbearable. And the hardest part about inconsistency is that it keeps you emotionally hooked. If someone were distant all the time, it would be easier to walk away. But inconsistency creates a push and pull dynamic. Just when you start to detach, they lean back in. Just when you begin to accept that something is off, they give you a moment of connection that pulls you right back. It's unpredictable, and that unpredictability keeps you invested. You start living in the maybe. Maybe they do care. They're just scared. Maybe they're going through something personal. Maybe if you give it a little more time, they'll become more consistent. But maybe is a dangerous place to stay for too long, because while you're holding on to potential, You're ignoring reality. And the reality is, consistency is not something that needs to be forced. It's a natural byproduct of genuine interest and emotional availability. When someone truly values you, their presence doesn't feel like a question mark. You don't have to decode their behavior. You don't have to guess how they feel about you. Their actions align with their words, and their effort doesn't fluctuate in a way that leaves you unsettled. There's a steadiness to it, a reliability that allows you to relax into the connection instead of constantly bracing yourself for change. But in an inconsistent dynamic, you never fully relax. Even in the good moments, there's a part of you that wonders how long it will last. You can't fully enjoy the connection because you've experienced how quickly it can shift. So instead of feeling secure, you feel cautious, guarded, always a little bit on edge. And over time, that confusion starts to affect how you see yourself. You begin to question your instincts. You wonder if you're expecting too much, if your standards are unrealistic, if your need for clarity is somehow a flaw. You might even convince yourself to accept less than you deserve just to avoid losing the connection altogether. But here's the truth that cuts through all the confusion. The right connection doesn't require constant interpretation. It doesn't leave you in a cycle of doubt and second guessing. It doesn't make you feel like you have to earn consistency by being more patient, more understanding, or less expressive. Inconsistency isn't just about their behavior, it's about what their behavior is creating inside you. And if what it's creating is confusion, anxiety, and emotional instability, then it's not something to ignore or justify, it's something to recognize for what it is, a clear sign that the connection is not meeting you where you are. It starts almost in a way that feels reasonable at first. You express a need, something simple, something honest. Maybe it's wanting more consistent communication, a little more reassurance, a deeper level of connection. And instead of being met with understanding, you're met with distance, hesitation, or a response that makes you feel like what you're asking for is somehow too much. You don't immediately push back. You pause. You reflect. You tell yourself, maybe I should ease up a little. Not because your need disappears, but because you don't want to create tension. You don't want to be seen as demanding or difficult, so you begin to soften your voice, not just in how you speak, but in what you choose to say. And this is where the shift begins. Instead of expressing your needs freely, you start filtering them. You measure your words, you rehearse conversations in your head before having them. You hold back certain feelings because you're unsure how they'll be received. You become hyper-aware of how your emotions might impact them, while they remain relatively unaware of how their actions are impacting you. At some point, you begin to associate your needs with risk. You think, if I say this, will they pull away? If I bring this up, will it create distance? If I'm honest about how I feel, will I lose them? So instead of risking that loss, you choose silence. But silence comes at a cost. Because your needs don't disappear just because you stop expressing them. They stay within you, unspoken, but very much alive. And the longer they go unmet, the more you begin to feel a quiet sense of dissatisfaction, kind of emotional hunger that isn't being fed. What makes this even more complicated is that you start adjusting your expectations to match their capacity. You tell yourself, maybe they're just not the kind of person who communicates a lot. Maybe I need tea. Oh, be more independent. Maybe this is just how relationships are sometimes. And while flexibility and understanding are important, there's a difference between adapting and abandoning yourself. Because when your needs consistently feel like a burden in someone's presence, it doesn't mean your needs are too much. It means you're in a space where they're not being valued. And over time, this begins to shape how you see yourself. You become someone who hesitates before asking for what they deserve, someone who downplays their emotions, someone who convinces themselves that less is enough, even when it doesn't truly fulfill them. You might even start to take pride in being low maintenance, not realizing that it's coming from a place of self-protection rather than genuine ease. But deep down, there's a quiet conflict, because a part of you knows you want more. You want to feel heard without having to fight for it. You want to feel understood without having to explain yourself over and over again. You want to feel like your presence, your emotions, your needs are not just tolerated, but welcomed. And that part of you doesn't go away. It speaks up in moments of frustration, in moments of loneliness, in moments where you feel the gap between what you're experiencing and what you truly desire. It reminds you that connection is not supposed to feel like constant compromise on your end. Because the truth is, in the right dynamic, your needs don't feel like a liability. They feel like a bridge. They create closeness instead of distance. They open conversations instead of shutting them down. They allow both people to understand each other more deeply, not less. And when someone is emotionally available, they don't interpret your needs as pressure. They see them as an opportunity to show up. So if you find yourself constantly shrinking your voice, minimizing your IAs, or questioning whether you're allowed to want more, it's not because you're asking for too much. It's because you're asking the wrong person to meet you in the way you deserve. At first, you don't notice it as a loss. You think of it as adjustment, compromise, growth even. You tell yourself that relationships require flexibility, that not everything can be on your terms. And that's true to a point. But what you don't realize is that you're not just adjusting your behavior, you're slowly adjusting who you are. It begins in small ways. You hold back a message you would have normally sent. You don't bring up something that bothered you. You laugh things off that deep down didn't feel right. You convince yourself it's not a big deal, that keeping the peace is more important than expressing every thought or emotion. And in isolation, these choices seem harmless. But over time, they accumulate. They create a version of you that is more focused on maintaining the connection than being authentic within it. You start to operate with a kind of quiet calculation. What version of me will make this easier? What should I say so they don't pull away? How can I show up in a way that keeps them comfortable? And without realizing it, your attention shifts away from your own truth and onto their reactions. You become more aware of their moods than your own feelings, more concerned with their distance than your inner peace. You start anticipating their behavior, adjusting yourself in advance just to avoid the discomfort of them withdrawing. And that constant anticipation, it's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain. Because you're no longer just being, you're performing. Not in an obvious, dramatic way, but in a subtle, internal way where you're editing yourself in real time, filtering your thoughts, softening your personality, reducing the parts of you that feel too intense, too emotional, or too much. And the more you do this, the further you drift from your natural state. You might notice that you're less expressive than you used to be, less spontaneous, less open. Things that once felt easy now feel complicated. You hesitate more, you question yourself more, you become more cautious, more guarded, not because that's who you are, but because that's what the dynamic has conditioned you to become. And somewhere along the way, you stop asking a very important question. Am I still being myself here? Because when you're focused on keeping someone close, you often lose sight of whether that closeness is costing you your identity. The truth is, real connection doesn't require you to shrink. It doesn't ask you to silence parts of yourself just to keep the other person comfortable. It doesn't make you feel like your natural way of loving, expressing, and existing is something that needs to be managed or toned down. In a healthy dynamic, who you are is not something you have to negotiate. But when you're with someone who is emotionally unavailable or avoidant, there's an unspoken pressure, a sense that too much honesty, too much emotion, too much presence might push them away. So you adapt, not because it feels right, but because it feels necessary, and that's where the loss happens. Not all at once, not in a way that's immediately obvious, but gradually, quietly, until one day you realize that you don't feel as grounded as you used to. You don't feel as clear. You don't feel as connected to yourself. You might even struggle to recognize what you truly want anymore because you've spent so much time prioritizing what they might want or need. And that's the moment where it becomes undeniable. Because a connection that requires you to lose yourself is not a connection that's sustaining you. It's one that's slowly taking pieces of you away. At the beginning, you don't label it as a lack of safety. You just feel a slight unease, something you can't quite put into words. You tell yourself it's just newness, uncertainty, or maybe your own overthinking. But as time goes on, that unease doesn't settle. It lingers, it grows. And it starts to show up in the way you experience the connection. Because emotional safety isn't just about feeling comfortable. It's about feeling secure enough to be fully seen without fear of withdrawal, judgment, or disconnection. And when that safety is missing, you feel it in subtle but powerful ways. You hesitate before opening up. You think twice before sharing something vulnerable. You question whether your honesty will bring you closer or push them away. Instead of feeling like you can lean into the connection, you feel like you have to brace yourself within it. There's a difference between being excited about someone and feeling anxious around them. But in a dynamic that lacks safety, those two feelings start to blur. You might feel drawn to them, intrigued by them, even deeply attached. But underneath it all, there's a current of tension that never fully goes away. You don't know where you stand. And that uncertainty becomes the foundation of the relationship. You notice that when you express something real, something deeper than surface level conversation, it doesn't always land the way it should. Maybe they change the subject. Maybe they downplay it. Maybe they respond in a way that feels distant or detached. And each time that happens, a small part of you pulls back. Not because you want to disconnect, but because you're learning that your depth isn't being met. Over time, this creates a pattern. You start keeping things light, even when you want something deeper. You avoid certain topics. You choose words that feel safe, instead of words feel true. You become selective with your vulnerability, offering only the parts of yourself that you believe won't create distance. But that kind of connection stays on the surface. And no matter how much time you spend together, no matter how many conversations you have, it never quite feels like you've reached a place of true closeness. There's always something missing. A sense of grounding, a feeling that you can fully relax into who you are without being misunderstood or dismissed. What makes this even more challenging is that you may still feel emotionally attached, because emotional safety and emotional attraction are not the same thing. You can be deeply drawn to someone who doesn't make you feel safe. You can crave their attention, value their presence, and still feel unsettled in the dynamic. And that contrast creates confusion, because part of you wants to move closer while another part of you feels the need to protect itself. So you exist in this in-between space. Not fully open, but not fully closed. Not fully secure, but not fully detached. And that constant tension begins to wear on you, because relationships are not meant to feel like emotional tightropes. They're not meant to keep you in a state of quiet anxiety where you're always trying to maintain balance, always trying not to say or do the wrong thing. Real connection creates a sense of stability. It allows you to exhale. It gives you the confidence that you can show up as you are, without the fear of losing the other person just because you were honest. When that safety is present, vulnerability feels natural. You don't have to force yourself to open up. You don't have to calculate how your emotions will be received. You simply express, and you trust that the other person will meet you with care, even if they don't fully understand. But when safety is absent, even the simplest, expression can feel like a risk. And the longer you stay in that environment, the more you adapt to it. You become more guarded, more careful, more restrained. You learn to protect your heart not by setting clear boundaries, but by limiting how much of yourself you reveal. And while that may help you avoid immediate discomfort, it also prevents the connection from ever becoming truly fulfilling, because without emotional safety, depth cannot grow. And without depth, no matter how strong the attraction is, something will always feel incomplete. It doesn't feel like a straight line. It feels like a loop, one that keeps pulling you back in just when you think you're ready to step away. You go through moments where you tell yourself, this isn't working, I need to detach. And for a brief period, you start to regain your clarity. You feel a sense of control returning. You begin to see things for what they are rather than what you hoped they could be. But then something shifts. They reach out. They show a little more interest. They say something that feels genuine, maybe even vulnerable. And suddenly, everything you were starting to accept becomes uncertain again. That's the cycle. It's not just about what they do. It's about how their actions interact with your hope, because hope is powerful. It has the ability to rewrite reality in a way that keeps you emotionally invested, even when the pattern itself hasn't changed. So when they give you a moment of closeness, it feels significant. It feels like progress. You think, maybe this is the turning point. You start to believe that all the patience, all the understanding, all the emotional effort you've been giving is finally leading somewhere. And for a moment, it feels good. You feel seen again. You feel connected again. You feel like you're not the only one trying anymore. But then, without warning, the distance returns. The messages slow down. The energy shifts. The connection that felt so present just days or even hours ago begins to fade. And you're left trying to understand what changed. You revisit the recent interaction, searching for clues. You wonder if you misread the situation, if you got your hopes up too quickly, if you somehow disrupted the progress that was being made. And instead of questioning the pattern, you question yourself. That's what makes the cycle so exhausting. It's not just the ups and downs, it's the emotional whiplash that comes with them. The sudden shift from feeling close to feeling distant, from feeling hopeful to feeling uncertain. And each time it happens, it takes a little more out of you. Because every high raises your expectations, and every low deepens your disappointment. Over time, you start to realize that you're not building something steady. You're reacting to something unpredictable. Your emotions become tied to their behavior in a way that feels almost involuntary. When they show up, you feel relief. When they pull away, you feel anxiety. And that kind of dependency isn't rooted in love. It's rooted in inconsistency. You begin to crave the moments when things feel right, not because they're stable, but because they're rare. And rarity can make something feel more valuable than it actually is. It creates a sense of urgency, a feeling that you have to hold on to those good moments tightly, because you don't know when or if they'll come back. But here's the quiet truth that starts to surface beneath all of this. A healthy connection doesn't rely on cycles to sustain itself. It doesn't need repeated breaks and returns to create meaning. It doesn't keep you guessing about whether the closeness you felt yesterday will still be there tomorrow. It builds gradually, consistently, in a way that allows trust to grow over time. In a cycle, trust doesn't grow, it resets. Every time you start to feel secure, something happens that pulls you back into doubt. And that repeated resetting keeps you emotionally stuck because you're always starting over, always hoping that this time will be different, even though the pattern remains the same. And eventually, you reach a point where the pattern becomes undeniable. Not because someone explained it to you, but because you've lived it enough times to recognize it. You start to see that the moments of hope aren't leading to lasting change. They're simply part of the cycle that keeps you from letting go. And that realization, it doesn't come all at once. But when it does, it changes the way you see everything. It doesn't shout. It doesn't force itself into your awareness. It speaks quietly, almost like a whisper beneath all the noise of your thoughts and emotions. And because it's so subtle, it's easy to ignore, especially when your feelings for someone are strong, but it's always there. That inner pull, that gentle sense that something isn't quite aligned. You might notice it in moments when you're alone, when everything is quiet and you're not distracted by messages, conversations, or temporary closeness. In those moments, there's a clarity that begins to surface. A feeling that asks you questions you don't always want to answer. Why does this feel harder than it should? Why do I feel unsettled even when things seem okay? Why do I keep doubting something that's supposed to feel right? And instead of leaning into those questions, you often move away from them. You distract yourself. You focus on the good moments. You remind yourself of their potential. Because acknowledging the inner voice means confronting a truth that might lead to letting go, and letting go is never easy when you've invested your heart. So you try to silence it. You tell yourself you're overthinking. You convince yourself that every relationship has challenges. You look for external validation that everything is fine. But the voice doesn't disappear. It shows up again the next time something feels off. The next time you're left waiting longer than you expected. The next time you feel a disconnect that you can't explain. It doesn't overwhelm you. It simply reminds you, gently but consistently, that what you're experiencing isn't fully aligned with what you need. And what makes this voice so powerful is that it doesn't come from fear. It comes from awareness. It's not trying to push you away from connection. It's trying to guide you toward the right connection. It's the part of you that recognizes when something isn't nourishing you, even if another part of you still wants to hold on. But the longer you ignore it, the quieter it becomes, not because it stops speaking, but because you become less willing to listen. You start prioritizing external signals over internal truth. You wait for them to give you clarity instead of trusting the clarity that already exists within you. You hope for a definitive moment, a clear sign, a final answer, when in reality, that quiet knowing has been there all along, and the cost of ignoring it is subtle but significant. You stay longer than you should. You invest more than you receive. You tolerate things that don't truly sit right with you, all while feeling a quiet tension inside, as if a part of you is being pulled in one direction while your actions are going in another. That 10. Cyan isn't random. It's what happens when your intuition and your attachment are in conflict. Your attachment says, stay, try harder, don't give up. Your intuition says, pay attention, this isn't it. And the more you choose attachment over intuition, the more disconnected you feel from yourself. Because your intuition is not just a feeling, it's a form of self-trust. It's built on your experiences, your values, your emotional awareness. It recognizes patterns even when your mind tries to rationalize them. It senses misalignment even when everything looks fine on the surface. And when you learn to listen to it, something shifts. You stop needing constant reassurance from the other person. You stop searching for answers in their behavior. You start trusting what you feel, even if it's inconvenient, even if it leads to difficult decisions. Because deep down, you realize that the right connection doesn't require you to override your inner voice. It aligns with it. It feels calm, not confusing. It feels steady, not uncertain. It feels like something you can trust, not something you have to constantly question. And that quiet pull you've been feeling, it's not there to confuse you. It's there to guide you back to yourself. Thank you for taking the time to listen and invest in your growth. It truly means everything. Goodbye for now, and may you always choose what brings you peace, clarity, and genuine love.